Okay, welcome everybody, and it's a great pleasure to introduce Dr. Dang Nguyen from RMIT University, who is an expert on many things, but including internet cultures of Southeast Asia, mobile phone cultures, and STS, which stands for Science and Technology Studies. So Dang, thank you so much for joining us for this research chat.
Yeah, pleasure to be here.
So Dang is the author of two excellent books. The first is called Internet Cures, The Social Lives of Digital Miracles. And the second is Digital Research Methods in the Diaspora, which is a fabulous handbook of methods for researching the internet. Dang has also published research on a range of other fascinating topics, including the history of QR codes, Facebook live streaming, and digital contact tracing during COVID. So Dang, you've done an enormous amount of things, but I thought we'd start off just by chatting about the research that you've done about internet cultures in Vietnam. So your book Internet Cures looks at how traditional Vietnamese medicine knowledge circulates online, and you write about digital miracles or folk cures using traditional healing practices, and you explore what this means in relation to health communication and also debates about misinformation. So one thing I really love about the book is that you do something really important, which is to, and I'm quoting from you here, infuse the notion of misinformation with history and culture. So could you tell us a bit about what you were trying to achieve with the book?
Yeah, absolutely. This is a central proposition of the book. And one of the biggest problems with how we talk about misinformation, I think, is that we treat it as a kind of deviation from the norm. So misinformation is a kind of pollution, of the otherwise healthy information environment. But if we zoom out historically, then we realize that humans have always circulated knowledge that mixes, observation with belief, with tradition, and even with speculation. It's not a new thing. And in many cultures, especially outside of the Western world, what counts as credible knowledge doesn't necessarily align with the norms of biomedicine or science communication. So when we look at, say, a Facebook post that instructs people to, rub a sliced onion on their feet to draw out illness, for example, it's easy to dismiss that as misinformation. But to me, that move is too shallow. It ignores the layered histories of how healing has worked in contexts like Vietnam, and how the body is imagined, or how spiritual and material forces are intertwined. So I wanted to show in my book that misinformation isn't just a matter of accuracy, but it's also a matter of meaning. So in the book, I try to build a conceptual language that connects what we see online to sort of longer epistemic traditions. So that's why I talk about, digital miracles. That's why I talked about sympathetic magic and mechanical spells, because those frameworks, to me, offer better ways to understand what people are actually doing when they engage with these cures. So to infuse misinformation with history and culture means refusing the flattening that happens when we treat these things only as either truth or falsity. And for me, it means restoring texture in the way that we understand information.
It's extremely important. And rewinding a little bit, could you tell us a bit about your background? So how did you become an internet researcher?
Yeah, so how did I become an internet researcher? Well, my training in internet research really began at the Oxford Internet Institute, where I did my master's degree. And that environment left a deep imprint on how I carry myself as a researcher. The OII was one of the first places where I encountered the internet, not just as a technical or policy issue, but as a deeply interdisciplinary object. So, the internet is something that demanded insights from all sorts of disciplines like sociology, anthropology, computer science, media studies, communication studies, all at once. So it was a space that valued conceptual clarity and methodological experimentation. And so I think that really shaped how I think about research about the internet even now. Well, but then later during my PhD, that orientation sort of felt a new register. I did my PhD in 2018 when the field was moving sort of aggressively toward political misinformation as a topic of study. So, but then I found myself drawn to other corners of the internet. So spaces where, the so-called miracle cures and folk knowledge were circulating. I wasn't interested in simply categorizing these as misinformation. I wanted to understand the beliefs and the infrastructures and the histories that made them compelling. So that's when the internet stopped being a field site and sort of started becoming something more like a terrain that I could read, that I could trace, that I could intervene in. So just to sort of wrap up this answer. So while my entry point was sort of formal and rigorous and sort of rooted in the kind of foundational training that I got at Oxford, it sort of quickly became something more exploratory and conceptual. And I think that's what research should be about. The internet became not just an object of study, but as a way of understanding how people live, how people narrate, and how people make meaning. And I think that's what really still animates my work today.
Fantastic. It's very inspiring. I think you've given us a huge enthusiasm for the diversity of what internet research is and could be. What is your favorite aspect of internet research? What gives you the most joy as an internet researcher?
Yeah, that's such a good question. Yeah, I think the best part about doing internet research is that you get to see firsthand, how the internet makes visible things that we didn't have access to before. So things like emergent rituals, distributed expertise, or experimental practices of care and belief. So it really opens up a window onto how people imagine the world and their place in it. The internet also challenges you to think in really interdisciplinary ways. It's not even a choice. It's sort of like in order to do internet studies, you have to think in an interdisciplinary manner, right? You can't study the internet well without crossing borders between different disciplines. And I think the messiness of it all is exactly the appeal. You're constantly pushed to ask, so what counts as knowledge? Who gets to speak? How do internet infrastructures shape meaning, and so on? And because the internet is always changing, it really keeps you humble. Just when you think you've figured something out, the form of it all shifts, and the platforms update, and the discourse sort of mutates. So that forces you to always be alert and be curious, and that's what's so exciting about it.
Terrific. Can I ask you some questions about, as an expert on the internet in Vietnam and Vietnamese internet cultures, have you noticed any differences about how Vietnamese internet users and communities use social media compared to other countries that you're familiar with?
Yeah, I mean, every context is unique in its own way. But that said, there are also similarities. So Vietnam is a Facebook first country, Facebook is not just a social platform, but it's sort of also the interface through which many people experience the internet itself. Then there is also Zalo, which is a homegrown messaging app, and it's also ubiquitous. TikTok has really taken off in recent years, much like in other contexts, especially among younger users and influencers. But I think Facebook still dominates when it comes to things like, health or commerce or community engagement. One major difference that I've noticed is the degree of improvisation and moral negotiation of what happens in Vietnamese digital spaces. So social media use in Vietnam isn't just about self-presentation. or entertainment. It's actually deeply infrastructural. So people use Facebook not only to share information, but to seek remedies, to report scams, to sell products, and even to participate in collective acts of judgment or forgiveness. So my research on miracle cures was partly drawn from the fascination that I have by, how Facebook groups became sites of ritual participation. So people would, for example, thank a healer in the comment section after taking their advice, almost like offerings. So there is a really strong participatory culture that isn't quite the same as influencer fandom, which is the dominant frame through which these things tend to be understood in, Western literature. But it's not entirely different either. So, it's the teasing out of like what's different and what's similar is the interesting thing. So the platforms may be global, but the practices are profoundly local. And that's something that digital research, I think, often misses when it applies frameworks built in the West to interpret activities elsewhere.
That's extremely important. And one of the books that we'll be reading as a class this semester is How the World Changed Social Media by Danny Miller and his collaborators there, which argues quite strongly that it's not a matter of social media changing the world, it's a matter of the world changing social media. And their particular, it's I think a very important idea. And their particular practices or cultures around platforms and social media that you've noticed in Vietnam that have gotten a life of their own, have come from the ground up and gotten a life of their own and kind of changed the way those platforms or systems operate?
That's such a good question. Things that happened in Vietnam that ended up changing the world.
Or changing platforms, or changing the way those platforms work.
This is where this leads perfectly into my current research on phone farming, which is not what this chat is about, but I could speak a little bit to that.
We have to talk about this. This is such a fascinating topic.
So I'm currently researching phone farming in Vietnam and Southeast Asia, and it's a practice where, I conceptualize this practice as, a form of general purpose computing infrastructure from below. It's where people repurpose discarded phones to then produce this sort of guerrilla tactical infrastructure to game platforms and earn money. And this practice has had profound impact on the way that the information environment is structured, precisely because they manipulate, the friction points and the cracks of where automated media and social media platforms operate. I'll give a concrete example. So, I think most people are familiar with bots and how social media engagement metrics can be gamed in bots. Phone farms are the engines behind these trades, and they operate out of Vietnam, but not just Vietnam.
We're talking, rooms full of secondhand phones, running dodgy scripts to create fake eyeballs on ads and things like that. Is that how it works? Or
and 24/7, and that's actually very important to the way that these operations function, because in order for you to trick platforms into believing that an automated phone running in the background is actually not is actually, but is supposedly a human being, you need continuous long-term engagements. And some of these phone farms even breed bots for up until 2 years. So there would be phones running 24/7, simulating human behaviors, as accurately as they can for years and years on end, without really engaging in any, campaign to sway public opinion. or things like that, which is, the worrying part, and it is where the money comes from. So some phone farms would breed bots for years and years on end, and once they've become, ripened, they will then be sold off on auction sites. So it's fascinating to think about how these things structurally impact and shape the way the internet operates, the way the web monetizes itself. Yeah, so it's not just social media. It's actually when we think about internet research, I think increasingly people are thinking in terms of infrastructure,
Yes.
in terms of the materiality of how information gets propagated, how we've come to the current state of many people would call, information disorders. And these are the things you can't understand in abstract terms. You really have to look on the ground at what people are doing.
Well, I think that's a beautiful note on which to end our chat, Dang. Thank you so much. You've given us so much
Fantastic.
to think about. I mean, your way of thinking about the internet and researching is very inspiring and instructive. And so on behalf of everybody, thank you so much for spending your time and sharing your knowledge with us.
Thank you, Ramon. And then, yeah, thank you for the opportunity to chat.